Joining us now, Jonathan Geyer. He's the managing editor at the American Prospect. Jonathan, welcome. I'm here with Emma Vigeland. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So we were just talking to Anel Shalain about our involvement in the Middle East, and one of the things that came up was the sort of the incentive structure for like the army to stay there, so that they can continue to get to build their budget year over year, I guess. And you've written a couple of pieces over the past couple of months about sort of some of the infrastructure that drives our expansion, I guess. I mean, you could call it our imperial expansion, and certainly our national security state. And it comes down to money. I mean, basically, it all comes down to money. But let's just I want to talk about Jake Sullivan. I also want to talk about Eric Schmidt, though, because I think both of those are at play here. You did an expansive piece on Eric Schmidt and his involvement in the adoption of artificial intelligence for a national security state. And he was sort of working both sides of it. Will you just explain that?
Yeah, it's sort of complex, but let me break it down. So the Google billionaire, Eric Schmidt, is on this government advisory board. It advises Congress and the Pentagon, saying, we need to invest in AI for war. We need machine learning, artificial intelligence, every aspect of defense and intelligence. But he's also investing as part of his venture capital work in the very companies that do this type of work. So it seems like a very obvious conflict of interest to have the chair of the National Artificial Intelligence Board also investing and making money off of these very technologies and making technologies tailor-made for war. So one of these companies I focused on, Rebellion Defense, it seems really cuddly and it's a kind of Star Wars joke, but really this is a revolving door issue. These are all former Pentagon officials who went into the private sector and are just making bank using all their connections. They know how grants and various awards work. These are million or billion-dollar projects. And you have this kind of revolving door factor of people making money off the previous government experience, chief among them, Eric Schmidt, a Google billionaire.
And I mean, this dynamic, this is why, we wanted to sort of pair the two of you here today, because this dynamic, when they're telling the army they got to buy this stuff, the army is buying this stuff. And this is basically, it is a self-licking ice cream cone type of situation. And it just is driving these policies that end up leading to the deaths of tens of thousands, hundred thousands of people. And because, and the answer, I mean, this is the thing, and this comes in, this is where, sort of like Jake Sullivan comes in, and you're writing about this notion of like this conflict and this confluence of consultants and academics, and they're wearing all these multiple hats. And there's this sort of, the response to the Eric Schmidt thing would be like, well, of course, he's the expert at AI. He's recommending they do it. Why wouldn't he go out and invest in these companies? Because he believes like, it's like, he's showing some integrity in his belief that he's actually willing to put his money where his mouth is on some level. But that's highly problematic.
Well, what I would say is, the kind of corruption, legalized corruption in Washington has got a lot of attention when it comes to the financial sector and not a lot when it comes to national security or foreign policy. So if you're Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, and you were advising Uber, you're advising big banks, you're advising even something funny like the toy company Lego over the past 2 years, it's not immediately clear how it's a conflict of interest, but you know that corporate influence has a huge role in how Biden is staffing this administration. And the place I'm really interested in is the consultancy world, because they're not quite lobbyists. We don't know who they're consulting for. The companies won't talk about it. The consultants won't talk about it. And yet they're cashing in on their recent government experience. And worst of all, from my perspective, advising companies over the last 2 years what a Biden administration or a Democratic administration might do when they're in power. So these represent real conflicts, and they're not exactly borne out. We don't know in the Situation Room how they're borne out, but we know that many high-level Biden officials were working for corporate interests over the past 2 years. That has to affect the way policies are made in Yemen and Saudi Arabia, wherever people have corporate or business interests.
Do you have a sense of what, I mean, what could break this cycle? I mean, short of, that this is endemic to capitalism, that are there ways in which to sort of like pull this apart in some way, so that those people who are influencing the policy of the United States, whether it's foreign policy or domestic policy for that matter, are not doing so because they have a vested interest, or that those interests are even aligned, right? I mean, even if you want to take the most charitable perspective, like, well, I just happen to believe in AI, and so of course I would tell the government to adopt it, and of course, if I have billions of dollars, I'm going to invest in it. But how do you like, what is it? Just simply making ethics rules, or what?
So, I mean, Biden does have the most robust ethics rules to date, but we need radical transparency. We need to go even further. I mean, I got my hands on some documents that showed, an average ethics form for this National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence is maybe 5 to 10 pages. Eric Schmidt's was 37 pages long. That has to be financial entanglements. When someone like a Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, when they make ethical disclosures, they disclose as little as possible. And we could really reform the rules to make sure that there's a wide amount of information about who these people's clients were. And by the way, what were they doing? I reached out to Microsoft, for example, which Jake Sullivan worked for. They didn't want to comment in detail, but it seems to me if you have a Microsoft breach about a month ago, and Jake Sullivan is tweeting about it and saying we need to download this Microsoft patch, you have to wonder, is he tweeting as the former advisor to the president of Microsoft or the current advisor to President Biden?
Is the consultant corruption, this new iteration of it, sort of a response to or a rebranding of what we saw get a lot of attention in the Bush administration as the Iraq and Afghanistan wars waged, where it was a lot clearer that these were defense contractors? Now we just have a smarter upgrade to the software, not to use an analogy that's especially relevant to what you're discussing.
Well, there's two crucial points. One is, it's not that the defense industry doesn't need a huge software update. They are behind, and that's true. It just doesn't need to be commercialized, let's say. And second, the corruption I'm talking about, it doesn't compare to the Trump level swamp where, there are really nasty entanglements. But even so, we ought to hold the Biden administration to a really high standard. And it's not good enough to say you were a consultant, but you're not going to extensively share your clients or exactly what you were doing for them. And there's this whole kind of soft space where, oh, these are AI companies, so that's different than defense. But in fact, they're all working on similar issues, and really radical disclosure and getting a really deep sense of what Biden officials were working on. 20 Biden officials in his top national security inner circle were working as consultants in the last couple of years. And that has to be very defining of how they see the world.
How many, I mean, so if 20 of them were working as consultants, how many exist? Like, what percentage is that?
I couldn't give you the percentage, Sam, but we're talking about, top people in the National Security Council and the State Department. I'm getting financial disclosures every day from the White House, and I'll say, oh my God, there's another person who was at Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State's firm. It just runs deep. And one of my concerns is people haven't been giving the kind of attention to consulting because it's not lobbying, but we might call it shadow lobbying. They are working for corporations. They're not directly asking government, hey, I'm working for this corporation. Can you help us out policy-wise? But they're doing everything but opening that door. And it's really crucial that we have a deeper understanding of how this whole network of shadow lobbying or consultancies work in the Capitol, in New York, in financial centers across the world.
I can't imagine anyone would disagree with it. We want more transparency. But how does that transparency, how is that transparency leveraged? I mean, it's, on some level, does it make a difference ultimately, or how would it make a difference if there was greater transparency and broader understanding of these dynamics?
So on a really narrow level, if there's a Microsoft breach, you can guard against that if you know Jake Sullivan worked for Microsoft very narrowly by saying, hey, we're not going to have our national security advisor work on this Microsoft breach. But I think it raises bigger questions that, as you know, transparency is not enough to guard against the conceptual issue that if you have 20 people in the National Security Council who are working for private equity and hedge funds, are they doing corporate foreign policy, or is it a foreign policy for American people? And the rub here is that what Biden is pushing for is a foreign policy for the middle class, but it sure doesn't square with what a lot of his key personnel were doing in between, in the lead up to this administration.
Well, I mean, he seems to be pushing for, I think, a foreign policy that's in the center of the national security establishment. I mean, like, what has Biden done since entering office that has deviated from the very problematic mean of what foreign policy, the foreign policy blob, as people refer to it as, in Washington has coalesced around?
Well, so far, Biden's really been taking a middle road, and it feels a little bit like inertia. Like when we saw with the attack on Syria, it wasn't the most maximalist attack on Syria. He didn't decide not to do it. With a reprimand to Saudi Arabia over the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, he did go ahead and do some kind of retribution, but it wasn't serious enough to really punish the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. We're kind of seeing Joe Biden, the former Cold Warrior, the former Senate Foreign Relations, triangulator, and someone who really is, we could say responsible for a lot of the great mistakes of the Iraq War, responsible for a lot of the mistakes of the Biden administration's middle of the road foreign policy. Now, it's too early to make really clear judgments of how bad or how good, we got to give them a little benefit of the doubt, things could be. But just looking at personnel as policy, I think there's some real concerns about the preponderance of consultants, a defense secretary who was on Raytheon's board, a number of people at the top echelons of power who are deeply connected to corporate influence. And my fear is that that's going to push Biden ever more towards the middle.
Yeah, I think, my sense is that, and they just came out and I think said yesterday that there was no interest. They're not going to even deal with Israel and Palestine. I get the sense that
Venezuela, their position on that, Bolivia. I get
the sense that Joe Biden is like, my administration is not going to be about foreign policy, and it's just going to be on some level like, let's just not do much. And unfortunately, sort of just maintaining this trajectory is problematic because of all this, these type of personnel who fill in these seats. Jonathan Geyer, managing editor at the American Prospect, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you
so much.